you will turn in your Bibles to the 5th chapter of 2 Kings as we continue our study through the Word. There was an amazing thing that happened in the ministry of Jesus Christ. And that was when lepers were actually healed by Christ. That he had taken those who had contracted this dreaded disease and he had touched them and healed them. We saw that there were 10 lepers that were healed all at once. And you remember that he sent them to the priests as a testimony now. The Messiah was here. In the history of the nation of Israel, there had never been a healing of an Israelite of leprosy. There had been Miriam, Moses' sister, you'll remember when she was struck with leprosy in her hand. And you'll remember that judgment was, she was struck with it and then she was healed of it immediately. She didn't contract it. That was a judgment of leprosy that was upon her. And that was also before the law was given there at Mount Sinai. But there was one person who was not an Israelite that had contracted leprosy and was healed by God. And we're going to look at that account here that's recorded for us in 2 Kings chapter 5. And we're going to see the way in which God's sovereignty works, and also in the way that faith is such a fragile thing. And yet we're going to see someone who is exhorted into faith, and we're going to see them respond in faith, and we're going to see how God moves also in response to faith. And so we're going to be talking about faith here this evening, and then also we are going to see some incredible work of the Lord through the prophet Elisha, as he is going to have his servant's eyes opened up to the spiritual reality. We live in this duplicity of life. We have the physical realm that we're operating in, but there's also a whole spiritual realm that is simultaneously engaged in the environment that is around us. Now, we're not privy to be able to see that spiritual realm. We saw that there was a moment where they come into glimpses. We saw Elijah as a chariot of fire came down from heaven and picked him up and took Elijah up into heaven. And suddenly the veil was pulled back and Elisha could see the spiritual reality that was behind the manifestation of Elijah being caught up into heaven. But there is that full reality of the spiritual world that is intersecting and colliding with our physical environment. And we're going to see where God is going to pull back the veil of Elisha's servant to be able to see into the spiritual reality of the situation and the circumstance that's there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Let's jump in here to 2 Kings chapter 5. And you remember that we had just seen Elisha do just amazing miracles. There was the miracle of the widow's oil. Remember that, where she didn't have any money and she was destitute, and Elisha told her, go borrow all the bowls that you possibly can. And then and the Lord just filled up all those bowls with oil. And it was according to her faith how many bowls she got as to the blessing that came back upon her. She was able to pay off the debt. They were going to seize her sons. Her husband was dead. We saw the raising of the Shunammite's son. We saw the pot of stew that was purified, and we saw the multiplication and the feeding of the 100. And so here, 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1, it says, Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. And he was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And so here we're introduced to Naaman, and he is this commander of the army. He is underneath the King Ben-Hadad, and we see that he was a successful man. We see that he was courageous, and he was victorious, and he was highly regarded because of the victories that he had gotten. But notice here that those victories that he had gotten, they were because of God. God was the one that was giving him these victories, and so we see here that God is raising him up so that he can use him ultimately as a testimony to his glory. And so he is helping him and giving him these victories, and he becomes valuable to the king. But at the same time, while God is raising him up, he also has contracted leprosy. And so in the Israelites, when you contracted leprosy, you were put out from community and from society. But there with the Syrians, that was not the case. He was able to continue with his leprosy to function as long as the disease would allow him to function in a competent fashion. But here we see that the king, no doubt, was grieving over the fact that one of his chief generals was going to be departing from him due to this disease, and he was a mighty man of valor. And so it says in verse 2, and the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Now, over the course of time, Syria and Israel were going back and forth with battles. And in one of these battles, this servant girl was captured and brought back. And she was now serving in Naaman's own household. And to Naaman's wife here we see that she comes and she says, it's too bad that he isn't in Israel, because in Israel there's a prophet that is so mighty, a prophet of the true and the living God, that he would be able to heal him of his leprosy. Now, we see also the quality of and the care that they were giving this servant girl, because here she desired to help him. So they were treating her well, and she was attached to them. And this prophet that lived in Samaria, this is Elisha. And he lived in a house there in the capital city in Samaria. And Naaman went in, verse 4, and told his master, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. So he goes to the king and says, there is help for me in Israel. There's a prophet there that can heal me of my leprosy, and tells the king of now the information that he received from this girl. And verse 5, it says, then the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And so he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. So we see that he comes now, and he has these gifts with him. He brings 10 talents of silver. Now, 10 talents of silver is 750 pounds. So he brings 700, not ounces, 750 pounds here of silver, and then 600 shekels. That's 150 pounds of gold that he brings without a car. That's a lot of weight to be bringing in now in gold. And then also 10 sets of clothing. These are all prized possessions back in the Near East. And so he brings a letter now to the king of Israel. That's the 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes. And you remember that Joram is the king over the 10 tribes during this period of time. And so he requests now that he be healed, that Naaman, his servant that he's sending to him, that he would be healed of his leprosy. Verse 7. And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? And therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." Joram is just dismayed. He's like, what? You're sending someone to me, a leper, and telling me to heal him. So what he thinks is happening is that he's being set up, that Ben-Hadad is just picking a fight with him and is using this as the method of picking that fight with him. And so he is just undone. He's seeing this as an aggressive tactic from Ben-Hadad that is then going to set up an attack that is going to come. And if he doesn't perform this, then they are going to be attacked. So he's asked to perform the impossible or you're going to be attacked. And you remember that Ben-Hadad, had earlier we saw where he had come to the city and he had surrounded and told them to send out their women and their gold and all of that, and he had incurred into their land. And so Ben-Hadad and the Syrians and the Israelites were constantly going back and forth during this period of time. They were currently at peace, but now he thinks that this is going to ultimately be a declaration of war that is being veiled behind an impossible task of healing his servant of leprosy. And so it was, verse 8, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Now, remember that Joram was still allowing the worship of Baal in the land, and so there was still continued to be false and idolatrous worship that was taking place. And here's Elisha, and he's the prophet of the true and the living God. And when we see that Joram gets into trouble, he doesn't send for Elisha. He doesn't send for the prophet of the true God. But when Elisha hears that the king has torn his robes and hears what has gone on, then Elisha offers and sends to him the aid and word of aid. "Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." In verse 9, then Nahum went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." And so we see here that Elisha doesn't even go out to meet him. And we see that Naaman is this decorated man of war that is in a high position with the Syrians. And so he is expecting to be treated as a dignitary. And Elisha doesn't even come out of his house and just sends a servant to him and tells him, "Here's all you need to do. You need a bath." Go dip, not once, not twice, 7 times. Get 7 times in the Jordan River, and your leprosy is going to be gone, and you shall be clean. And so here we see that the cure didn't lay in the water of the Jordan River. That's not what the cure was based on. The cure was based upon the faith in God's promise that was delivered to him through the prophet. And would you believe God, or will you not believe God? And so the faith, will you exercise faith and believe God or not? And we see that Naaman is going to be upset in his flesh. He was upset that he wasn't treated well, that he wasn't received in a fashion that he was used to. He's also insulted at the idea that all he needs to do is to just go dip in the Jordan River 7 times. And so he is going to respond in the flesh, and he is going to take offense. He says, and so, verse 11, but Naaman became what? Furious. And he went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. He had the whole thing in his head the way that it was supposed to transpire. You know, he's at the door. He made this long journey, and the prophet's going to come out and do his whole prophet thing here over him, and he's going to be healed. But what happened? What happened is that he had a prescribed notion of how God was going to work. And when God wasn't going to work in the way that he expected God to work, then we see that he's offended with that. Sometimes we can put God in a box. We can start to believe that God is going to function in a certain avenue or capacity. If I only do this, then God is certainly, and we start to have these contracts in our mind, or we start to make these provisions for the way that God should act, or the expectations that we have. He had an expectation. And one of the things is that when we have an expectation that isn't fulfilled, then we get hurt by that. And then we get angry over the unfulfilled expectation. And so that happens with people, but it also can happen in our relationship with God. I remember that there was a woman one time that I had visited in her house, and she had a Bible on her in her bookcase, and I said, "Oh, you have a Bible?" And she says, "Yeah, I don't read it anymore." And I said, "You know, why? What happened?" And she says, I can't worship a God that would have let my daughter die." And I said, "Tell me about that." She says, I went to church every single Sunday. You know, I did everything that I was supposed to do, and my daughter died. So I'm not going to worship a God that's going to be like that. And we had an opportunity to extend that conversation, but what happened is that she had an expectation of how God was going to work, that if she was going to do this, then he would take care of her. And then she defined what taking care of her looked like and had this expectation. When God didn't perform his end of her expectation, then she got hurt with that, and then she walked away from the Lord. Naaman has an expectation of how God is going to work. He's got an expectation that the prophet's going to come out and he's going to do this and call down the thing, and his leprosy is going to heal. And when he wouldn't even come out of his house and tells him to just go take a dive in the river, you know, that offended him in his flesh and his hurt. He was hurt by that. And so he says, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. And are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? And so he turned and went away in a rage. You know, it's like, look at this the Jordan River, it's nothing. We got real rivers, you know, back where I come from. This is just a mud puddle in motion, you know. I mean, I am not going to be, you know, and what's happening now is, look at, I mean, he's offended, he's insulting, you know, the Jordan River now, and we see the animosity that is coming out of him because of the hurt that is inside of him. And so he goes away and in a rage. In verse 13, but his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? If he said you have to go scale that mountain, and then in the morning you need to to pour water over yourself at the first crack of light and then scale back down the mountain, if he had given you some great challenge, some great task for you to do in order for you to be healed, would you have been willing to do that? And of course the answer is he'd do anything. He had already made the journey from Damascus and all the way there in order to be healed. And so here we see that he asks him, if he had asked you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then? How easy is it then, he says, when he says to you, wash and be clean. What I love about this servant is that it's representative of that person that comes alongside and restores a brother and sister when they are hurting, when they're frustrated, when they're discouraged, when they're angry, when bitterness has got a grip on them, and comes in and just with that gentle hand of encouragement, just ministers to their heart. How oftentimes we need encouragement. It's not easy. And walking with the Lord and working out our faith is not easy. And oftentimes we can get to that place where we need encouragement. Everybody needs encouragement. And here we see someone who had been given the word of the Lord. Here's truth right in front of you. Here's what you want in your life. But you're walking away from it. Don't walk away from it. Come, let us reason together, the Lord says. Though your sins are scarlet, they can be made white as snow. Come, let us talk this through. Let's let cooler minds prevail on this. And I love that intercessor that comes now and comes alongside and helps, that Barnabas, that encourager that comes along. And may we be Barnabases to the people that are around us. May we be encouragers to those that we see that are struggling in their faith, in their walk. And so this servant comes and encourages them. Go. He's asked you to do an easy thing. Don't be offended. Just go do it. Wash and be clean. Verse 14. So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. We see a twofold miracle that takes place here. Not only was his leprosy removed from him, but then his skin was restored all the way back to the skin of a child. I mean, this was better than a laser treatment here to take off age spots and all of that he had. He ends up now with brand new baby skin. I mean, this was beyond just the removal of the leprosy. And so a mighty miracle takes place. It says in verse 15, and he returned to the man of God. Now he feels foolish, doesn't he? Because of the way that he had conducted himself, because of the anger and the disappointment that had manifested, that he didn't just accept what the prophet said readily and go and do that. And isn't that also the way that we are when we don't trust God and then we work it back out to where we get on board with the Lord and then everything works out and we're like, man, when am I going to learn? You know, when am I going to learn? And so now here he circles back to the man of God. And he returned to the man of God and all his aides and came and stood before him. And he said, indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. And now, therefore, please take a gift from your servant. And so he comes back and he wants to express his thanksgiving to God. Notice here also that, you know, in Syria there were the false gods and he was worshiping false gods. But then he came and was healed. The false gods were not able to heal him of his leprosy. And now, what was the result of the healing of the miracle was praise went to God. Praise went to God. And he says, now I know that there is no other God except the God of Israel. And so he says, here, take a gift. Verse 16. But he said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Elisha wasn't a prophet for hire. He wasn't someone that you could come and then hear for a donation or for a significant amount. You could move him to act. He was the Lord's servant, and when the Lord told him to do something, then Elisha did it. And so there were in those days prophets for hire. And Elisha is separating himself from those that were in it not for the right reasons, but for the wrong reasons. And so here we see that even after it's urged upon him, then he still refuses. In verse 17, so Naaman said, then, if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. For your servant will no longer offer either burnt offerings or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. And yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant. And when my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing. And then he said to him, go in peace. And so he departed from him a short distance. So we see that he wants to take dirt back from Israel to Syria now, to where he can worship the Lord on holy ground, on the ground of Israel. And so when he has to help his master worship Rimmon, who is a false god, then he says, may the Lord forgive me as I now am doing it just as a servant who is underneath orders. And so we see that suddenly his conscience was bothered him by even the act of assisting into the false worship and into idolatry. In verse 20, we're going to see the story now of Elisha's servant Gehazi, and we're going to see that Gehazi is greedy, and he can't stand the fact that there was this opportunity to receive riches that just ended up passing him by. I mean, there was a once in a lifetime, this was the jackpot ticket here that just came into his hands, and now Elisha is not going to cash it in. And so he doesn't want to see this opportunity go by. But Gehazi, verse 20, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, look, my master has spared Naaman this Syrian while not receiving from his hands what he brought. But as the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him. And so Gehazi pursued Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, is all well? So Gehazi chases after, waits till after they depart, and he excuses himself from Elisha's presence, and then he takes off and books it after Naaman. So he sees him coming, gets off, is everything okay? In verse 22, and he said, all is well. My master has sent me, saying, indeed, just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the mountains of Ephraim. And please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments. So he wants a small handout here, a portion here. And verse 23, so Naaman said, please take 2 talents. And he urged him and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of garments and handed them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them on ahead of him. And when he came to the citadel, he took them from their hand and stored them away in his house, in the house. And then he let the men go, and they departed. And now he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said to him, where did you go, Gehazi? And he said, your servant did not go anywhere. You know that when your parents asked you that question, you knew you were busted, you knew you were in trouble, you know, that's kind of the tone here, and Gehazi is he knows that he's in trouble. Verse 26. Then he said to him, did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from his chariot to meet you? Is it time to receive money and to receive clothing olive groves and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male and female servants. Is it time to retire, to take your ease? Are you going to stop serving God, and now are you going to collect material possessions and now worship them? Have you switched your master? And so, verse 27, he says, therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever. And he went out from his presence leprous, as white as snow. In severe cases of leprosy, the hair would turn white and the skin would turn white in the leprous condition. And so he has a full outbreak of leprosy that takes place. Gehazi misrepresented God. Gehazi is representative of a person that's not in ministry for the love of the Lord, but is in the ministry for what he can get out of it, the opportunistic individual. We see Judas is another example of a person that was in the ministry with Christ, but yet when it wasn't going to give him the financial rewards that he was seeking after, then he betrays Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Gehazi betrays the confidence and the trust of Elisha, who he is serving, works behind his back, cuts his own deal. He's a deal maker, always looking for the next deal. And so when an opportunity presents itself, man, he pushes aside the things of the Lord and goes and does what's in his own best interest. But God will not have that kind of a man serve him. And we see that there is a judgment that comes upon him, and it removes him from his place of serving the Lord. And so we have to choose whether or not we are going to race after the world or whether we're going to follow after God. And if you want to serve the Lord, then you have to turn your back on the things of the world. There is a better reward that comes from being rightly connected to God and being used by him. In chapter 6, we are going to see another miracle begins, the floating axe head. There is a revival that's going on. There is a fullness that's taking place in the schools of the prophets. It's always good when seminaries and Bible colleges and Christian schools are filling up and overflowing, and there is the need for more space. We see that when talented young people are interested in following after the Lord, that's a good sign of things that are going on. And so that's the situation. There were the schools of the prophets where these men were being raised up and trained up and developed. And we see that there is one, most scholars believe that it was probably the school of the prophets that was located at Jericho that was overflowing, and they need to have a building project to acquire to be able to handle now the space that was necessary to be able to raise up this next generation. It says, and the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, see now the place where we dwell with you is too small for us. Please let us go to the Jordan, and let every man take a beam from there, and let us make there a place where we may dwell. And so he answered, go. They want to expand. They want to build, and they come and they bring the problem to him. And Elisha says, go, to do it. In verse 3, then one said, please consent to go with your servants. And so he answered, I will go. And so he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. But as one was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water, and he cried out and said, alas, master, for it was borrowed. So he's swinging the axe, and he's chopping, and on the backswing, there went the head, off. And as luck would have it, or misfortune would have it, it flew right into the Jordan River, out into the middle of the Jordan River. And he's like, oh my goodness, how terrible this is. I remember having that kind of a feeling one time. I was in California, they had this golf driving range that you could go to, and they had these golf balls that floated, and you hit these golf balls out onto this lake, and man-made lake, and you aimed at these islands that you would then land the golf ball on. And these balls, they floated, so they had like the same normal weight of a golf ball, but their composition was a little bit different. So it was just fun to try and see if you could land the golf balls at various degrees on these islands. But at the time I was working in Golf Magazine, they always give you these tips to work on, and one of the tips that I was working on was trying to have a really loose grip on the club. And so you can see what's happening here, and I'm swimming away, and I get to my last ball, and I really want this loose grip to really crack through the ball, and so I loosen the crack, and there went my club swing, and it just flew right out into the middle of the lake. Now, if it normally happened at any other driving range, all you do is you just, they would just stop everybody for a second. You would be humiliated, but you'd run out, get your golf club, and come back. But here, my golf club. So I went over to the person that was at the thing. I said, I can't believe my golf club slipped out and they went out into the lake. And they said, oh, we can get it for you. I said, you can get it for me? I'm like, this is awesome. They said, give us your name and number, write down the kind of club that it was, and we'll be able to get it for you and return it to you. And I'm like, that is amazing. I said, when are you going to be able to return it to me? And they said, every 3 years we drain this, and I'm like, oh, man. So to this day, I have a mismatch in that set. So he's chopping, and that axe head goes flying off, and and boom, out into the water. And the terrible part is that it was borrowed. And in those days, that was expensive machinery that they were operating with here. And so, verse 6, so the man of God said, where did it fall? And he showed him the place. And so he cut off a stick and threw it in there, and he made the iron float. And therefore he said, pick it up for yourself. And so he reached out his hand and took it. And so here we see just this incredible miracle that takes place of the axe head that floats up, and just the comfort of those men that were in that school of the prophets to see God's provision, God's protection, God being with them. None of them would have ever forgotten their entire life, the way that God moved so powerfully in their midst. And God does those things to be able to establish and strengthen our faith, to be able to continue to walk in his ways. And I want you to know that God's interested in building up your faith. Whatever strength of faith you have right now, whether it is just a tiny crumb or whether you are strong in your faith right now, God wants to continue to build your faith. He wants you to continue to listen to this. Trust him. Trust him. Trust him with what his word tells us. Believe in the things that God is telling you and has revealed. The reality of his words in your life and in the avenue and course and the decisions that you are making. His desire is that you would build godly marriages, that they would be built according to his principles. He's the one that has created marriage, and he is the one that has structured it. And we are the ones that are either going to build our own definition of marriage, or we're going to trust and believe that what he says is true. And we are going to build these biblical marriages, these godly marriages. He tells us to trust him in the way that we're to raise our children, and the way that we're to discipline them or not discipline them. And the world is telling us one thing, and God is telling us another thing. He wants to strengthen you in your faith and your ability to believe him. and then to walk in his ways. And so here we see that he was encouraging and building the faith of those prophets, those men that were in those schools of the prophet. Now, in verse 8, we're going to see God again move mightily in Joram, who is the king over Israel, over those 10 tribes. And we see that he keeps wavering between the God of Israel and these false gods and the worship that was going on in the land. He wanted to, ease his bets and worship in all the different camps so that he's covering all of his bases. And rather than driving out all the false worship and dedicating himself to the true and the living God. And he wanted the true and the living God to be a part of his life, but he didn't want to commit fully to him. And I find that there are so many people that are like that they want to commit themselves to God and to the things of God, but they also want the things that are in the world at the same time. And so they're divided in their heart. And you remember Joshua when they're entering into the land. Choose you this day who you're going to serve. Make up your mind. This one foot in the camp of the Lord and one foot into the world. It's not where God wants you. It's not the fullness of what you were created to live. You're shortchanging your own life by your inability to commit to God fully. And here's the king of Israel in that camp. And so how is he leading the nation? He's leading him as a double-minded man who's unstable in all of his ways. And so here the Lord is going to try and demonstrate to him his might and his power and his glory. It says in verse 8, now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants, saying, my camp will be in such and such a place. And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there. And then the king of Israel sent someone to the place of which the man of God had told him, and thus he warned him, and he was watchful there, not just once or twice. So the king of Syria is making these surprise raids into Israel. And every single time they're going to make a surprise raid, Elisha knows, the Lord tells him where the surprise raid is coming from, and he tells Joram, and then Joram goes and sends a patrol, and he catches them. Not once, not twice, many times this is happening here. In verse 11, therefore the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing. And he called his servants and said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? There's a spy in our group. Someone is leaking out our information to the Israelites. And verse 12, and one of his servants said, none, my lord, O king. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. He says, there is nothing hidden. Your most private, intimate conversations, those are going directly, but no one's bugged your palace. It's God that is doing that. And he's delivering that information to Elisha the prophet. In verse 13, so he said, go and see where he is, that I may send and get him. And it was told him, saying, surely he is in Dothan. In verse 14, and therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there. And they came by night and surrounded the city. Here's what's funny to me. The king knows that Elisha, you can't sneak up on him because God keeps on telling him what's going on with the plan. So what does he say? I'm going to go sneak up on the prophet now and take my army at night and go and get him. And so here it says in verse 15, and when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, alas, my master, what shall we do? And so he is freaking out when he sees an entire army that's gathered around the city because of you. They want you. And now a whole army from Syria has come and surrounded, laid siege to the city. And that is not a good morning. That's not a good way to start your day, is when you come out and there's an army of the enemy that is encircled the residence, the city, and wants you. You remember how Jesus told Peter that Satan was asking for him by name, was sifting and asking for him by name. Here is the enemy encamped around now that city just to get at Elisha. And the enemy is seeking to put armies out against you, to lay traps for you, to take you out, to take you down, to destroy everything that's precious to you. It's a reality. You need to know that. We cannot just lark through this life as if there is not treacherous spiritual opposition. The more that you're going to let your light shine, the more irritated the enemy is with that light that is shining in the enemy's eyes. And so here we see that there is this circle of an army that is gathered around them there in Dothan. What shall we do? In verse 16, so he answered, do not fear. Don't you love that? There again, we see how many times in the Bible do we see God telling us over and over and over. Yeah, it's easy to say, don't fear. Did you see the army that's out there? I mean, that's easy words to say, but look at the reality of the situation. And over and over and over, we see God telling us, don't be afraid. If I'm for you, who can stand against you? If I'm with you, what do you need to be afraid of? And I know that you've got challenges and battles that are scary to you right now. And from where you sit right now, from where you stand in your life, it might feel like there is a whole army that is around you, and there is no way that you're going to be able to withstand. But I want you to know that with God, all things are possible. And that God is for you and God is with you and God is not going to leave you. And so the first words out of the prophet's mouth is, don't be afraid. Don't let fear grip your heart. There's the battle once again with fear and faith. Faith drives out fear and fear drives out faith. And those two will not mutually coexist, but you have to choose which one that you're going to dwell on. Which one that you're going to allow to stay resident in your heart. There's the initial shock of fear. That's the initial. But then you have to decide who's going to get residence. And whether or not fear has to just be an uninvited guest that's excused back out again. You cannot stop it from paying you a visit because it's an emotion, but you can choose to trust God, to hold on to God. And that faith just pushes the fear right out of your life. And so here we see the prophet ministering now to his servant. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Trust God. Get your eyes on God. Your problem right now is that your eyes are on your problem and your eyes are not on God. And so he says, do not fear. For those who are with us are more than those who are with them. There was no one with them. It was just him and his servant there in the city, and there's this whole army. And here's the prophet saying, hey, there's more of us than there are of them. And he's like, 2. We got 2. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Is that awesome, or is that awesome? That's, Lord, I want to see that. I mean, I want you to pull back the veil to be able to see the reality. I mean, here's this army that thinks that they've got Elisha surrounded, and God has that army surrounded with chariots and horses of fire that are there at the ready now to protect and to defend. I mean, God is mighty and powerful, and he is for you. And there are angels that are watching over and battling in the spiritual realm. And, and so oftentimes, when you see these warring angels in the demonic realm, you say, how many angels are there? How many angels are there? And we don't know. But here's what I do know. We got the bad guys outnumbered 2-1. Did you ever think about that? 1/3 of the angels fell. That means the good guys are 2 good angels for every bad angel. So whatever it is, we got 2 good ones for every bad one that are out there. We got them outnumbered, gang. So that is awesome. So he opens up his eyes, and here he allows him to see into the spiritual realm. And so when the Syrians came down to him, verse 18, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. So, here's the captain of the guard of the Syrians. Let's move in. And so as they start to move in, the Lord just smites them, and they're all blind. The entire army goes blind all at once. And then look at what happened. So Elisha, you know where he goes? He goes out, and now he talks to the blind army that is out there. Okay, verse 19. Now Elisha said to them, this is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. But he leads them to Samaria. He leads them now to the capital city, and he tells them that the man that you seek is there. He's the man that they're seeking, and he's the one that leads them. Does God have a sense of humor here, or what? Leads this blind army to Samaria. Samaria was this big gated city. It was the capital city of the 10 northern tribes there of Israel up there. And so they open up the gates, and in marches this blind army, that's there. And so he led them to Samaria. Verse 20, so it was when they had come to Samaria that Elijah said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and they were inside Samaria. They are now inside, trapped by the army of Israel's army, and they walked them right in, opened up their eyes, and there they are, captives. Verse 21. Now when the king of Israel, that's Joram, saw them, he said to Elisha, my father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? And verse 22, but he answered, you shall not kill them. Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and your bow? Set food and water before them that they may eat and drink and go to their master. And then he prepared a great feast for them. And after they ate and drank, he sent them away, and they went to their master. So the bands of Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. When you eat together a meal, it binds you in fidelity to never betray your trust to them. So when they had a meal with them, they couldn't attack them again, these soldiers, according to the custom. And so they had a feast for them and sent them back. And so here, we see that Israel's victory was not by might nor by power, but it was by my spirit, says the Lord. And here we see that God goes before us, and God moves in miraculous ways, and he still does that in our lives. Now, verse 24. It says, and it happened after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria, and indeed they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and 1/4 of a cab of dove droppings for 5 shekels of silver. And so what had happened is that the Syrians came and they laid siege now to Samaria. This is later on. And now things, when you choke off a food supply to a city, it doesn't take too long for that food supply to run down. And so now a donkey's head, which would normally been worth almost nothing, now it was selling for ridiculous prices. So the famine is getting really bad. And what's happened is that that the Lord has told Elisha is in Samaria, he's inside there, he's inside the city with them, and Elisha has told the king that God is going to deliver them out of this famine. So the king is waiting for God's deliverance from this famine, but every day things are getting worse and worse and worse, and so the famine is getting greater and greater and greater. And so verse 26, it says, "Then as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, 'Help, my lord, O king.' And he said, 'If the Lord does not help you, where can I find help for you? From the threshing floor or from the wine press?'" He's saying, I don't have food. I can't materialize. I can't help you. There's nothing that I can do." And then she tells him his story. And then the king said to her, What is troubling you?" And she answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her on the next day, 'Give your son that we may eat him.' But she has hidden her son." Can you imagine how that would make the king feel? How famished everybody was, and the starvation that was taking place inside of that city as it was being laid siege. In verse 30, it says, "Now it happened when the king heard the words of the woman that he tore his clothes. And as he passed by on the wall, the people looked, and there underneath he had sackcloth on his body. And then he said, 'God, do so to me and more also if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on him today.'" You know what he's saying? I'm sick of waiting. That's it. I'm done with this. Elisha said that God is going to deliver us from this, but I can't take this anymore. I can't take anymore. Elisha is done. But Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. And the king sent a man ahead of him. But before the messenger came to him, he, being Elisha, said to the elders, "Do you see how this son of a murderer has sent someone to take away my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold him fast at the door. And is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" And while he was still talking with them, there was the messenger coming down to him. And then the king said, "Surely this calamity is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" And so we see that the king and Elisha are going to have a confrontation over this situation, and we'll pick that up next time. But there are times when it is difficult to trust in the things of the Lord, and when it is hard. God's timing is not our timing. We would like to have our trials over immediately, quickly, and yet God has a purpose in every single trial. Whatever trial you're going through right now, I want you to know God has a purpose in it. And he's not wanting to hurt you through it. He's trying to mold you and change you and help you. All things work together for good. What things? All things. Whatever you're going through, I want you to know that there is a blessing to what you're going through. God is teaching you things through it. And the minute that he's taught you what you need to learn and grow, then you'll be out of that and on to the next lesson that God has for you. So open up your heart and say, "God, give me a soft heart towards you. Help me to learn what it is. Strengthen me. Not lighter loads, but stronger backs, Lord. Not lighter loads, stronger backs to be able to handle the load that you've given to us." Let's pray. Father, help us to trust you even when things are difficult, even when things are hard. Help us to not put you in a box. Help us to continue to grow strong in our faith. And this day, Lord, would you bless us and be with us and fill us. Strengthen our marriages, strengthen our families, strengthen our relationships, Lord. Help us to be more completely connected to you. And Lord, help us in our weakness strengthen us. Be there in our sorrow, Lord. Bless us and help us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray.